Get her back, today. That was all President Everett Lang said when Harborcrest's security line rang at 7 in the morning. No explanation, no negotiation, just 4 words that turned Graham Reed's certainty to ash. Because 24 hours earlier, Reed had fired her himself, signed the paperwork with his own hand. Leona Barrett, night shift ICU nurse, 12-year veteran. The woman he'd labeled insubordinate, disruptive. A problem the hospital no longer needed. What Reed never knew, what no one at Harborcrest ever knew, was that 17 years earlier, Leona had kept a bleeding senator alive for 47 minutes in a building 200 meters from a blast site with almost no equipment. That senator was now sitting in the Oval Office. She saved the most powerful man in the country. Then a hospital fired her for saving everyone else. If this story already has you leaning forward, hit subscribe on Mystic Chapters. There are more stories like this one waiting for you, and you won't want to miss them. The termination meeting lasted 11 minutes. Graham Reed had scheduled 30, but Leona Barrett didn't give him the fight he'd prepared for. She sat across from him in the administrative conference room on the 4th floor, the one with the frosted glass wall and the framed hospital mission statement nobody read anymore. HR Director Denise Harlan sat to Reed's left, a manila folder open in front of her, fingers resting on the edge of it, as if she might need to grab something quickly. Reed slid the termination letter across the table himself. He didn't ask anyone else to do it. Leona picked it up, read it once, and set it back down without expression. The letter cited continuous insubordination, failure to maintain collegial relationships, and conduct inconsistent with Harborcrest's professional standards. It was a thorough document. Someone had worked hard on the language. Leona asked one question before she stood up: whether any patient had ever been harmed by a decision she made. Neither Reed nor Harlan answered. Leona nodded once, the way a person nods when they already know the answer, and pushed her chair back from the table. Nobody said anything as she walked to the locker room. Her locker held almost nothing: a cracked coffee mug she'd owned since her first year at Harborcrest, a photograph of her father from the early 2000s when he was still healthy, and a small square of fabric with a faded military insignia she kept folded against the back wall. She placed all 3 in a cardboard box the hospital had provided, changed into the civilian clothes she'd arrived in that morning, and carried the box down the service corridor toward the parking structure. Not to avoid anyone. It was simply the shorter route, and Leona Barrett had never been a person who took the longer one when the shorter one worked just as well. What Reed believed, watching her go, was that the problem had been resolved. He'd managed difficult employees before. He understood the pattern: a grievance filing, maybe a union consultation, a period of noise followed by settlement and silence. He'd already spoken with the hospital's legal team. The documentation was clean. The narrative was clean. Leona had a record of going outside the chain of command, of filing formal complaints against senior physicians, of refusing to accept that a hospital wasn't a battlefield where one person could override the entire command structure because they had a feeling about something. Reed had framed it that way to the board, and the board had agreed the situation was unsustainable. What Reed didn't know was that in a federal security database maintained by an office most people had never heard of, Leona's name carried a designation that had nothing to do with nursing credentials or performance reviews. The notation was brief and bureaucratic, the way important things often are. Priority medical asset, available for activation in national security contexts. Reed didn't know because that kind of information doesn't appear in a hospital's HR system. It lives somewhere else entirely. How she became unfireable before anyone realized it. To understand how Leona Barrett became unfireable before anyone realized she was, you have to go back about 8 months. To the first time Reed looked at her and decided she was a problem rather than an asset. Dr. Nolan Beckett was chief of cardiology at Harborcrest, a physician whose reputation rested on 2 things: genuine technical skill in the operating room, and an absolute certainty that his judgment never needed a second opinion. When a 53-year-old woman came into the emergency department with chest tightness and an elevated heart rate, Beckett reviewed her intake, spoke with her briefly, and documented her presentation as anxiety-related hyperventilation. He cleared her for discharge. Leona was pulling a double shift that night and happened to review the chart before the patient was released. The inconsistencies were subtle: a slightly prolonged QTC interval on the ECG, a family history notation Beckett had apparently skimmed past, a description of the chest discomfort that didn't fit the anxiety diagnosis as cleanly as the chart suggested. She flagged it and requested additional testing. Beckett overruled her, and the patient went home. 2 days later, the woman was brought back by ambulance in the middle of a serious myocardial infarction. She survived. The emergency team moved quickly because Leona's original evaluation notes were still in the system, giving them a baseline that saved critical minutes. The patient never knew a night shift nurse had tried to keep her in the hospital 2 days earlier. Leona filed a formal report on Beckett's decision. The investigation lasted 3 weeks and concluded the situation was a miscommunication between clinical staff, rather than a failure of medical judgment. Beckett received no disciplinary action. Leona received a written warning for not respecting the authority of the attending physician. She kept a copy of that warning in the same folder as the patient's discharge records and the ambulance report from 2 days later. She didn't show the folder to anyone. She simply kept it. 4 months after that, a post-surgical patient named Calvin Ruiz began showing signs of sepsis. He was 61, recovering from a bowel resection, and the resident assigned to his care dismissed Leona's concern as nursing staff overreach, telling her to focus on her own responsibilities. Leona stayed past the end of her shift, monitoring Calvin without being asked to, logging every observable change. When his condition deteriorated 4 hours later, Dr. Julian Cross happened to be on call. Cross reviewed her notes, recognized what was happening, and intervened in time. Calvin Ruiz went home 3 weeks later. Cross signed the medical record. Leona received another warning, this one for operating outside the clinical chain of command. Cross did not add his signature to the disciplinary form. He also didn't speak up on her behalf. He simply declined to be part of it, quietly and without explanation. The closest thing to support she got from anyone with a medical degree. The final incident wasn't about a single patient. It was about all of them. Harborcrest had been running short-staffed in the ICU for nearly a year, a consequence of Reed's workforce restructuring plan, which had eliminated several senior nursing positions to cut overhead. It looked reasonable on a spreadsheet. On the floor, it meant the remaining ICU nurses were consistently working patient loads above the recommended safety threshold. Reed's solution, announced in a memo sent at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday, was mandatory additional shifts, 2 extra per week per nurse, effective immediately, with no timeline given for reassessment. Leona wrote a response. Not a complaint filed in frustration, but a formal, documented, specific report outlining the connection between nurse fatigue and adverse patient events, citing the staffing ratios Harborcrest was now violating, and requesting the board review the data Reed had used to justify the restructuring. She copied it to 3 board members. Reed found out within the hour. That was the moment the situation changed category for him. An employee who complained internally was a management challenge. An employee who went straight to the board with documentation was something else entirely. Reed spent 2 days building the case, then scheduled the termination meeting. The call Leona spent the evening after her firing at her kitchen table, updating a resume for the first time in 12 years. The cardboard box sat on the counter. She hadn't decided whether she'd need the photograph and the mug at another hospital, or whether she'd do something else entirely. She had options she hadn't considered in years: federal health programs, civilian contractor work with military medical units, consulting roles that occasionally appeared in her inbox from people who somehow knew her background, even though she'd never advertised it. She made a list, made coffee, and went to bed at a reasonable hour, because she understood that exhaustion is its own kind of liability. 24 hours after the termination meeting, the secure line at Harborcrest's administrative office rang at 7 a.m. The staffer who answered thought it was a vendor call at first. Then the caller identified themselves, and the call was transferred to Reed's office so fast they forgot to put it on hold. The caller explained that President Everett Lang would arrive at Harborcrest within 36 hours for a confidential cardiovascular procedure. The visit had been planned for 6 weeks. The White House advance team had pre-cleared the facility, the personnel, and the security protocols. Leona Barrett's name appeared on the pre-cleared nursing roster as the designated ICU coordinator for the president's stay. When the advance team ran the roster against the hospital's current active employee list that morning, her name no longer matched. Reed explained that Ms. Barrett had been separated from the hospital for cause, and that he had several qualified alternatives. The voice on the other end interrupted him. It wasn't the advance team coordinator anymore. Reed recognized the shift in register before he even registered the voice itself, because there's a particular quality to how someone sounds when they aren't used to being interrupted and aren't going to be now. President Everett Lang asked Reed directly whether he had fired Leona Barrett. Reed confirmed that he had. The president said 4 words and ended the call. Get her back. Today. Reed sat in his office for a long time afterward, holding the phone, trying to understand what kind of night shift ICU nurse gets a personal call from the President of the United States at 7 a.m. He didn't have enough information to answer that question. He wouldn't have enough until it was too late for the answer to help him. The first morning, without her at Harborcrest, the morning shift was already underway. In the ICU, a young nurse named Camille Reyes started her rounds. She'd trained under Leona for most of the past 2 years. She knew the particular efficiency of how Leona moved through a shift. The habit of cross-referencing medication deliveries against the pharmacy log before entering anything into the system. The way she'd stand in a patient's doorway for a few extra seconds before entering. Reading the room in some way Camille had never fully learned to imitate. The ICU felt different without her. Not imprecisely, just hard to describe. The absence of a kind of attention. A new medication delivery had arrived overnight. The dosage notation on 2 vials was inconsistent with standard labeling format. The kind of small discrepancy that could mean a transcription error, or something more serious. Leona would have flagged it before the vials reached the floor. Camille found it 3 hours later, after it had already been logged into the administration system. She corrected the record, confirmed no patient had received anything from the affected batch, and filed the incident report. She was thorough about it, but she understood uneasily that thoroughness after the fact isn't the same as the kind of attention that catches something before it becomes a fact at all. That was the first hour of the day Leona Barrett wasn't there. By mid-morning, Reed had made 6 phone calls trying to reach Leona through official channels and failed, because she had no obligation to answer calls from the institution that had fired her a day earlier. The White House was already arranging to reach her directly. Reed just didn't know that yet. And the not knowing was its own kind of consequence. The kind a person earns after spending years building a system where only certain information reaches the top. The agents arrive, a federal SUV, arrived at Harborcrest's restricted service. Entrance at 9 a.m. 2 agents stepped out and began walking the perimeter. The methodical way people walk when they aren't looking at any one thing but taking in everything at once. The facilities manager trailed behind with a clipboard, answering questions he hadn't anticipated. Which corridors connected to the East Wing? Whether the freight elevator had a manual override? Where the backup generator fed power to the ICU? And how long the switchover took? The agents wrote everything down without explaining why any of it mattered. Reed watched from the 4th floor window. He'd already proposed 3 alternatives to the White House Advance Coordinator, a senior ICU nurse with 20 years of experience, a trauma-certified RN who'd served 2 stints in a military hospital, and finally Dr. Julian Cross himself. All 3 were declined, not rudely, but with a finality that closed the door on further proposals. The pre-clearance process, the coordinator explained, was specific to individuals, not job titles, and the individual cleared for this operation was Leona Barrett. Reed was beginning to understand he'd made a decision without knowing all the relevant information. A different kind of problem than making a decision with the information and getting it wrong. Down in the ICU, Camille was trying to hold the morning together. The patient in room 4, 49-year-old Lorraine Park, recovering from chest surgery the previous afternoon, had been logged as stable overnight. The numbers backed that up. Vitals in normal range, pain managed, oxygen saturation holding steady. But Camille had been in that room twice already, and something wasn't adding up the way stable pictures usually did. A slight irregularity in Lorraine's breathing, one side of her chest moving a little less than the other, her heart rate trending up slowly, the kind of progression a chart flattens into a single average number. Camille stood outside the room and thought about what Leona would have done. Not a useful exercise, because she already knew the answer. Leona would have been inside 30 seconds ago, hand on Lorraine's back, feeling the difference in expansion between the two sides. She'd have called Dr. Cross before Camille even finished formulating the concern, without worrying whether the attending physician thought the call was warranted. Camille thought about the warnings Leona had received for exactly that kind of initiative. She closed the chart, told herself the monitors would catch anything significant, and moved to the next room. It was the kind of decision that feels like caution and functions like something else entirely. Around 10 a.m., the emergency radio at the nurses' station crackled with a dispatch update. A multi-vehicle accident on the northbound highway. A charter bus involved. Casualties described as minor. No immediate hospital transfer required. The charge nurse noted it and turned the volume down. It sounded handled. The second call, Leona's phone rang at 11:17. She didn't recognize the number, but she recognized the prefix and answered on the second ring without preamble. The voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard in 17 years, though she'd have known it instantly in any context. Because there are some voices you don't forget after spending 47 minutes in the dark telling the person they belong to that they need to keep breathing. That breathing is the only job they have right now. That everything else can wait. Everett Lang had been a senator from Virginia when his convoy was hit. The trip was classified, so the official record of what followed was thin and purposefully vague. What it didn't capture was the abandoned building 200 meters from the blast site, or the field medic who dragged a bleeding man inside it while gunfire continued outside, or the 47 minutes that followed, during which that medic kept him alive using materials that would have seemed inadequate in any clinical setting. Leona had been 26, deployed with a Special Operations Response Unit, treating wounds in circumstances that never appeared on any resume she'd ever submitted. She'd told the senator to press his own hand against the wound and keep pressing no matter what, and worked around that hand for the better part of an hour until the extraction helicopter arrived. She never thought of it afterward as extraordinary. She thought of it as a shift that went badly and ended well. The president told her he'd read the termination letter. Someone on his staff had flagged the personnel discrepancy as a matter of procedure, and he'd asked to see it himself. He said he understood she'd been fired for doing exactly what she'd always done, and that didn't surprise him. Because the kind of attention she paid to things other people overlooked was exactly the kind that made certain people in authority deeply uncomfortable. Leona listened. She said she appreciated the call, but going back to Harborcrest for 36 hours while the president had his procedure wasn't a solution to the underlying problem. A temporary reinstatement wouldn't undo a firing designed to send a message to every other nurse in that building. President Lang said he understood. He needed her at Harborcrest. But more than that, the patients in that building needed her there. Leona told him plainly what it would take for her to walk back through those doors. The termination suspended immediately. An independent investigation opened. Every disciplinary citation tied to her patient safety reports reviewed, and no retaliation against any staff who cooperated with the investigation. The president said those terms were acceptable. She said she'd be there by 8 the next morning. Back through the doors, she stepped out of a black SUV at 8:15, 2 agents flanking her with practiced neutrality. Staff near the entrance stopped moving. Some had been on shift when she left 32 hours earlier, carrying that cardboard box. Now they watched again, and the quality of the watching was different. Leona walked past the reception desk straight to the elevator bank. She didn't stop at administration. She pressed the button for the ICU. Camille was at the nurses' station when Leona walked in. Surprise, relief, then the particular discomfort of someone realizing they've left something undone. Leona read it accurately, without making a production of it. She asked Camille to pull every chart flagged in the past 24 hours with anything outside normal parameters. Camille pulled Lorraine Park's file first. Leona read it standing up, went into the room without explaining what she was looking for, put her hand on Lorraine's back, and felt the asymmetry immediately, the left side moving fully, the right about 30% less. She listened without a stethoscope first, then with one, checked the oxygen saturation manually against the monitor, noted the slight divergence, and called Julian Cross. Cross arrived in 4 minutes. He didn't ask her to justify her concern. He went in, did his own assessment, and came out with the focused look of someone confirming what he already suspected. He ordered the intervention without discussion. It was a slowly developing tension pneumothorax, staying just below the alarm threshold, which made it more dangerous, not less, because the equipment had been giving false reassurance for hours. Lorraine was stabilized before it became irreversible. She'd never know how narrow the margin had been. Reed appeared in the ICU doorway 20 minutes later with a security officer, saying Leona's paperwork hadn't been formally processed, and her presence in a clinical area was a liability issue. One of the White House agents who'd followed her up stepped forward and informed Reed that Ms. Barrett was operating under direct presidential authorization, and that any interference would be addressed at the federal level. The security officer looked at the agent, then at Reed, and didn't move. Reed looked at Leona and asked who she really was. She answered plainly, the way she answered most things. A combat medic with a U.S. Army Special Operations Unit. Service in Afghanistan and Iraq. Mass casualty events with no reliable equipment, no backup, no second opinion. Environments where the difference between alive and not alive came down to whether someone was paying close enough attention before things became obvious. That was why she couldn't look at a chart showing subtle respiratory asymmetry and decide it was probably fine. Where she'd worked, probably fine was how people died. Camille, standing close enough to hear, would later realize that the quality she'd always noticed in Leona, the refusal to accept probably fine, wasn't a personality trait. It was a skill built under conditions Camille couldn't imagine, in places she hadn't known Leona had been. The firmness she'd sometimes read as stubbornness was the same thing that had just kept Lorraine Park's situation from turning irreversible. The bus and the board, the advance. Team's full security assessment landed on Leona's temporary workstation at 2 p.m. She read it in 8 minutes. A critical transport corridor blocked by improperly stored equipment. The ICU staffing roster mismatched against the cleared personnel list. A discrepancy in 2 controlled medication categories. The night shift running below minimum safe coverage. And 1 line carrying more weight than its brevity suggested. Multiple nursing staff had declined to report known issues out of fear of institutional retaliation. If Harborcrest couldn't correct all of it within the remaining window, the president's visit would be canceled and a federal review of the facility initiated. Reed understood, reading over her shoulder, that the documentation he'd built his case against her with had just become the documentation that would be used against him. Then the radio, turned down the previous morning, crackled back to life. The charter bus accident hadn't been minor after all. Injuries had been undercounted at the scene. 12 patients were being transported to Harborcrest, 4 critical. First ambulance 8 minutes out. At the same moment, Lorraine Park's monitor began alarming again. A second complication at the surgical site requiring immediate attention. The ICU's available staff split in the only direction they could, which wasn't enough direction to cover everything that now needed covering. Leona looked at the board. The patients already in the unit, the incoming trauma cases, the security requirements for a presidential visit less than 20 hours away, and made the kind of calculation that doesn't come from a protocol manual. She'd made it before, in buildings with no electricity and no backup and no time to second-guess herself. The math was the same. The building was different. She started moving. The first ambulance backed into the bay 3 minutes later. By the time the second arrived, Leona had already reorganized the floor. She found Marlene Foster, the afternoon charge nurse, near the medication room and gave her 3 instructions in the time it took to walk past. Call in every off-duty nurse within a 30-minute radius, open the secondary recovery area used during the winter surge, and clear the restricted transport corridor herself if she had to. Marlene had worked long enough to recognize actual authority when she saw it. She didn't ask for clarification. She went to find a dolly. Leona put Camille on Lorraine directly, with instructions to update Dr. Cross every 15 minutes regardless of whether the numbers changed. Cross agreed to stay anchored to the room for 2 hours without negotiating. He'd seen enough in the past 4 hours to know Leona's assessments didn't need his doubt added to become valid. What remained was the harder problem. 12 incoming patients, 4 critical, arriving into a unit already below safe staffing, while maintaining presidential security infrastructure less than 18 hours out. Not compatible under normal resource allocation. Leona wasn't working with normal resource allocation. She was working with what was actually there. She went to the White House Advance Coordinator, Agent Caldwell, and told her the presidential visit protocols needed to be restructured around the medical reality of the next 12 hours, not the other way around. Caldwell looked at the incoming patient board, looked at Leona, and asked what she needed. Leona gave her a specific list. Reposition 2 cleared security positions so ICU staff could move between floors without checkpoint delays. Move the presidential medication inventory to a secure location closer to the ICU, and patch communications to a secondary channel that didn't route through the hospital's overloaded internal network. Caldwell made 3 calls and came back with confirmation on all 3 within 11 minutes. Reed watched from the corridor. He'd stopped trying to intervene. There was nothing left to intervene in. The agents had made his authority effectively theoretical, and the staff had stopped looking to him for direction hours ago, not out of defiance, but because there was a more functional source of direction available, and people in a crisis moved toward function. The critical case from the bus arrived at 2:23, a man in his mid-50s, blunt thoracic trauma, blood pressure dropping steadily for 40 minutes. The emergency team was competent, but the resuscitation was fragmenting the way it does when multiple things happen at once, and no one has explicitly taken the coordination role. Leona stepped into the bay, not to take over the medicine, but the coordination. Who went where? Which intervention preceded which? Who talked to the attending and on what timeline? The room settled the way a room settles when someone turns on a light. The patient's pressure stabilized 18 minutes later. The attending physician meeting her for the first time asked which department she was from. She told him. "ICU," he said, nodding, as if that explained something he'd been trying to place. She was back in the presidential security briefing room by 3, picking up contingency planning from exactly where she'd left it, answering a question about defibrillation response times and suggesting a modification that shaved 40 seconds off the theoretical worst case. It wasn't a credential. It was the specific product of having worked where the cost of a slow decision was measured in something other than paperwork. What the investigation found by evening, the floor had found a rhythm. 3 of the 4 critical bus accident patients were stabilized. The 4th was in surgery and holding. Lorraine's fluid complication had been watched, closely enough that Cross could intervene, with a minor procedure instead of a major one, the difference between 2 extra days of recovery and something far worse. The transport corridor was clear. The staffing roster matched the security clearance list. Every problem on the federal assessment had a resolution attached to it, and Leona had written brief notes explaining not just what had been fixed, but how it had been allowed to develop in the first place. The staffing shortage, the culture of not reporting, the gap between what administration knew and what was actually happening on the floor. She submitted the notes knowing they'd be read by people beyond the advance team. President Everett Lang arrived through the East Security entrance at 7 the next morning, less than 48 hours after Graham Reed had signed Leona's termination letter. The procedure went without incident. Afterward, he asked to speak with the night shift nursing staff, and came to the ICU rather than asking them to come to him, a choice people in that hallway would remember for a long time. He didn't describe the details of what had happened 17 years earlier. That record stayed classified, and it wasn't his story alone to tell. But he said clearly in front of the assembled staff that Leona Barrett had saved his life long before she was a night shift ICU nurse in that building, and that she'd spent the years since saving lives that would never make any record at all. Asking for her reinstatement hadn't been a favor to an old acquaintance. It had been correcting a mistake. And mistakes like that, in institutions meant to protect people, carry a cost that doesn't stay contained to the person they're made against. Reed stood at the far end of the corridor. The staff nearest him had left a few feet of space on either side. Not deliberately. Just the way people redistribute themselves around someone whose authority has visibly collapsed. The board suspended his operational authority that afternoon. The independent investigation that followed over the next several weeks confirmed what Leona's documentation had been indicating for years. The staffing shortage had been known and concealed. Physician misconduct reports had been filtered before reaching proper review. Disciplinary actions were disproportionately concentrated among staff who'd filed safety concerns, and in at least 6 cases, including Calvin Ruiz's patient records. had been reframed in administrative summaries to minimize the visible role of clinical staff decisions in the outcomes. Read, resigned before the investigation. Concluded, Dr. Nolan Beckett was suspended. Pending formal clinical review, Denise Harlan told the investigating committee that the decision to terminate Leona had effectively been finalized before the termination meeting began, and that the meeting itself had been procedural. Going back, the board offered Leona the position of ICU nursing director 3 weeks later. She didn't accept immediately. She took 2 days, then came back with 3 things she needed in place. Not conditions for negotiation, but the shape of what the role had to mean to be worth doing. An independent safety reporting system that bypassed administrative review, formal protection for any nurse requesting a secondary evaluation regardless of the attending physician's initial call, and a staffing model built from patient safety data first, with cost considerations applied afterward. The board accepted all 3. There wasn't much room, given the circumstances, to do otherwise. She went back to night shifts for the first few weeks while the transition was structured. On a Tuesday evening near the end of the month, Camille found her in the break room, refilling her coffee in the same cracked mug that had come back out of the cardboard box and resumed its place in the cabinet above the sink. Camille asked why she'd never told anyone about the president, about what she'd done all those years ago. Leona considered the question, actually thinking about it rather than stalling. She said the patient in front of her never needed to know who else she'd saved. They only needed to know she wasn't going to walk away from them. The history was hers. The work was theirs. Camille asked if she had any regret about coming back, whether it was hard to return to the place that had tried to make her disappear quietly. Leona looked through the break room window into the ICU corridor. Lorraine Park was visible at the far end, working with a physical therapist on her first lap of the hallway, one hand on the rail. A card from Calvin Ruiz had arrived that week, handwritten, a page and a half, with a photo of him at his daughter's birthday party. The younger nurses, the ones who'd watched what happened to Leona and then watched what happened because of what happened to her, had started doing something different. When they noticed something on a chart that didn't fit, they said so. Not loudly, just clearly. The way a person speaks once they've been shown that speaking is survivable. Leona told Camille she hadn't come back for the people who fired her. She'd come back for the people who would have been on the other side of a bad decision if no one was there to catch it. The ones already in those rooms, and the ones who'd arrive tomorrow, and the ones after that. Night settled over Harborcrest. The corridor lights shifted to their quieter evening register. The monitors kept their steady count. Leona put down her coffee, picked up the patient board, and walked back into the hallway. The work continued. And now, when she said something, the whole floor listened. Leona never asked to be seen. She just never stopped showing up. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Mystic Chapters. Every week we bring you stories about people who chose to do the right thing, even when it cost them everything. Those stories deserve to be heard, and we'd love for you to be here for the next one.